Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines is a first-person shooter that was developed by Black Ops Entertainment, published by Atari and released on the PS2 and Xbox in November of 2003. It was met with awful reviews during its release and currently has a Metacritic score of 38, which, as you can imagine, filled me with so much hope when I learned it was going to be the game I was reviewing this week. It's hard to know where to begin with this one, so I guess I'll start with the game's premise. As the name suggests, it's based on the film of the same title, which was released in cinemas roughly 5 months earlier that year. You play as the Terminator, and the plot of the game sticks somewhat closely to the plot of the film, except there is a lot more missions up front that take place in the future as you're fighting with the Resistance. The developers of this game already had an uphill battle in this regard, as the movie wasn't too great in the first place, but this sort of extended version of the film that you get to play in the game adds nothing of value to the experience, and honestly, my brain turned off after the first few cutscenes. Now, when it comes to movie tie-ins, I always keep my expectations low because anyone who played games in this era knows what the deal is. But even with my expectations lowered, this game still managed to be far worse than I imagined. From the moment I loaded up the first mission and simply tried to look around, only to find that the sensitivity felt way off, I just knew that I was in for a terrible time. After doing my best to adjust to the poorly tuned and awkward movement, I then got into a bit of a shootout with some of the other Terminators. I fired off a few rounds, and instead of watching them break apart and explode, I watched them stiffly fall over like cardboard cutouts. On the subject of shooting, I think the developer knew that the controls and aiming were broken because they included a lock-on button. You could argue that locking onto a target is just one of the fancy features of a Terminator, but I'm sorry, in the case of this game, I'm just not buying it. Most of the enemies are unbelievably easy to take down, as 80% of them move at a snail's pace and aren't very accurate themselves. You'd almost think that it would be exciting to play a game where you fight Terminators, humans, drones, tanks, airships and more, but on top of the shootouts in this game being hard to control, they'll also bore you to death as the robots just keep coming and coming, but offer no challenge at all. What also doesn't help is that the weapons feel limp and lifeless, and considering over half of this game takes place in the future, you would assume that there'd be some awesome futuristic weaponry to play with, but you would be wrong. In one mission I had a rocket launcher with enough ammo to never change to a different weapon, so I spent the entire mission using the rocket launcher and still didn't have anything close to what you'd consider a good time. See, the problem here is that while it throws a ton of enemies at you and does its best to give you a decent variety of weapons, there is no creativity to the mission design. It all feels like a chore that you have to trudge through, and there aren't really any objectives. And I know, you could probably boil down most shooters to you just shoot stuff, but in this game, you really do just shoot stuff. Actually, that is kind of a lie. Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines is quite special because it's almost two genres in one, and is both one of the worst shooters and one of the worst fighting games I've ever played. On occasion, you'll get into these one-on-one scraps which don't make a lot of sense. You'll have a real basic combat system, and I can kind of see what the developer was going for here, but this just feels bland and as boring as the rest of the game. Speaking of bland things, the environments. Oh, the environments. I mean, I know this game is partly set in a post-apocalyptic world, but come on guys, we can surely have put together something that is a little more visually appealing than this, right? There's a little more light and colour that gets introduced towards the tail end of the game when you go back to the past before all the nukes went off, but you probably won't stick it out long enough with this game to see that because every aspect of its presentation is poor. The animation of the weapons and enemies look budget, the textures look fuzzy and stretched, the character models look stiff and jagged, the cutscenes, well, actually the cutscenes could look a lot worse, but they still do not save this game. Fitting right in with every other element of this incredibly poor video game is the sound design. Not only is the soundtrack below par, but it also loops endlessly and feels very out of place at times as you're walking down an empty corridor, but some epic score is blasting out as if you're in a fight for your life. The worst part of all of this is that they managed to get Arnold in the studio to record his lines. He's supposed to sound like an emotionless robot, so I'll give him a pass on that side of things, but as you're progressing through the levels, he'll just blurt out random things that have no relation to the situation.
Fantastic.
In conclusion, Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines is a game that should not exist, but it does, and due to my obligations to this channel, I've made the sacrifice of playing it so you don't have to. It has a boring plot, terrible controls and ugly visuals, so there is literally no reason for you to go anywhere near it unless you are a glutton for punishment. I wish this game fell into the so bad it's good category, but sadly it's just so goddamn bad.